A happy volleyball player finds love on the internet, but when she meets the guy in real life, things take a scary turn. Annie gets a new laptop for her birthday from her parents, Will and Lynn. She's thrilled and stays up late talking to her online friend, Charlie. When school starts, Annie works hard at volleyball tryouts. After school, Serena invites her to a party and asks her to bring her brother because the popular girl likes him. Annie is excited and tells Charlie about it. Later, she takes a nervous photo of herself to send to him. The next day, she makes the volleyball team, but instead of celebrating with her mom, the team rushes to tell Charlie the good news. Charlie congratulates her and compliments her photo. Annie asks him for a picture of himself, and that's when he reveals he's older than he said, making her anxious. Despite her doubts, Annie pretends to understand why he lied because she doesn't want to lose her friend. Then Charlie sends his photos, and Annie smiles at his handsome face. Annie goes to Serena's party, but her brother Peter can't make it because he's getting ready for college, which disappoints Serena. Annie leaves the party early and tells her dad that she felt uncomfortable when her schoolmates started talking about intimate things. She still wants to be friends with them, but Will advises her to be true to herself instead of changing for friends. Annie thinks her dad doesn't understand what school is like and goes to her room to continue chatting with Charlie, who reveals his romantic feelings for her. One day, Annie goes shopping with her friend Brittany. Lynn picks them up and notices they were with the popular girls. Annie admits that Serena convinced her to buy something revealing to look more attractive, but her mother disagrees with changing for guys. That night, Annie talks to Charlie, and he suddenly confesses that he's older than he said, which alarms her. Then, Charlie calls, and she demands to know why he keeps lying. Eventually, he convinces Annie to trust him again, and she falls for him. On the day her parents take Peter to college, Annie shares the event with Charlie. To her surprise, the man takes the opportunity to ask her to meet up. After some thinking, she decides to go to the mall, feeling both nervous and excited about meeting him. However, Charlie turns out to be different from the person in the pictures he sent, and he's much older than he previously claimed. This makes her cry. Charlie explains that he lied about his age because he was afraid she wouldn't understand. He insists that he's found a deep connection with her, reminding her that he's still the same person she's been talking to, so age shouldn't matter. A little while later, Brittany, who works at one of the stores, spots Annie walking with the older man. They end up at an ice cream shop with Charlie. At first, she feels uneasy, but she starts to relax when he gets her to talk about her family. Charlie gives her compliments and earns back her trust, eventually convincing her to accept a ride from him. While in the car, he gives her a gift, and Annie feels uncomfortable when she sees it's a revealing outfit. Despite her discomfort, Annie reluctantly agrees to try it on for him. She joins him in his motel room and puts on the outfit. Anxious, she quickly changes back into her own clothes, but Charlie persuades her to stay with him. Terrified, Annie is frozen when he begins to touch her. He goes on to do things against her will. To make things worse, Annie is unaware that there is a hidden camera in the room. That evening, Annie is devastated when Charlie stops responding to her, and she desperately clings to the hope that her terrible experience means something. Days go by, and Annie falls apart, thinking that Charlie has left her. Brittany confronts her about her behavior, and suspects that Charlie was the older man she was with at the mall. Annie avoids her questions, making Brittany realize the ordeal her friend went through. However, Annie denies that it was something awful, insisting that she and Charlie are in love. Brittany is not convinced, so she eventually reports what happened to the school. This leads to the police escorting Annie out of the school, which draws the attention of her classmates. Her parents are soon informed about the situation, and they rush to the hospital where Annie is being examined. When the family reunites, the hospital counselor, Gail Friedman, and FBI agent, Doug Tate, introduce themselves as they are handling Annie's case. Later, the police gather evidence from the family's home while Doug tells Annie to try talking to Charlie again, hoping to catch him. But the disappointed woman refuses, so Lynn suggests that she should just express her feelings to Charlie. This approach works, and Charlie eventually calls Annie. She picks up the phone while the officers trace the call. However, Charlie catches on quickly, hangs up and blocks her, which breaks Annie's heart. She storms off. Will can't stop thinking about his daughter's experience, and the next day during a meeting, he's so preoccupied that he spaces out. As a result, he starts researching ways to find Charlie. One day, Annie attends therapy with Gail, even though she insists she doesn't need it. She mentions that her classmates engage in casual relationships, so she thinks her experience shouldn't be a big deal. Annie still believes she's in love with Charlie, and that her parents would accept him if they knew him. When their age difference is mentioned, she repeats Charlie's statement that since they're soulmates, it doesn't matter. While this is happening, Will is at the airport, having skipped work to meet with a private investigator. Doug calls him and reports that the motel had no record of Charlie since he paid in cash. When they traced his IP address, it led them to another country, suggesting that Charlie was using a VPN. This means that Charlie had planned everything carefully. That night, Lynn checks on her daughter and shares that Brittany is upset because Annie won't talk to her. However, Annie blames Brittany for ruining her relationship. At that moment, Will arrives and shows his wife that he gained access to a criminal database. He has a list of criminals that match Charlie's description and asks Annie to help identify the man. She strongly refuses, emphasizing that no crime was committed against her. This upsets her parents, who see that their daughter is still under the man's influence. Despite this, Will continues his investigation, even visiting the home of one of the registered criminals. In another therapy session, Annie vents about how her parents treat her like a fool for dating Charlie. Gail wonders what Annie will do if Charlie talks to her again, and Annie's mood brightens at the thought. Concerned, Gail encourages Annie to talk about what happened in the motel. Hesitantly, Annie admits that during the experience, she felt like a bystander. The therapist explains that when people feel threatened, they sometimes distance themselves psychologically from the situation as a way to protect themselves. Annie becomes angry at the implication and ends the session early. Meanwhile, Doug leads an operation to arrest a suspect, but when he calls Will, he says they got the wrong person. They suspected this man because he used the same chat room and had similar conversations as Annie's friend. Will, knowing they have access to Annie's chat history, asks to see the conversation. Doug refuses, saying it would violate Annie's privacy. When the detective goes to the restroom, Will becomes curious and looks at his suitcase. He quickly goes to Lynn and shows her copies of the chat transcripts he took from the agent's bag. Lynn is shocked when she reads the sensitive parts of the chat and finds it hard to believe that her daughter wrote them. However, Will thinks they need to talk to Annie about her behavior. Lynn disagrees, fearing it might push Annie away. Despite her concerns, Will is determined to take action. As he leaves, Doug calls him and tells him to return the transcripts, warning that stealing them is a crime. Will promises to return them eventually. Will attends a company launch party but feels uncomfortable with their campaign using models that look like his daughter. Worried, he leaves. Late at night, Lynn finds her husband chatting with someone he thinks might be Charlie. She's bothered by this, but her husband explains it's a way to draw the criminals out. Seeing him treated as normal, Lynn shakes her head and leaves. A little later, Will checks on Annie and goes through her phone to make sure she's not talking to strangers again. When he leaves, Annie wakes up and finds her phone unlocked, making her suspicious. On another night, Lynn mentions that Peter might visit soon. Annie insists on not letting her brother know what happened to her, and her mother promises not to tell. Annie returns to school hoping to find a sense of normality. This gives Brittany a chance to talk to her, but Annie believes she's ruined her and her family's life. That night, Will asks about Annie's day, hoping for a normal conversation. His daughter gives short answers, so Will asks directly if Charlie has contacted her. This makes Annie defensive, and she challenges him to check her phone. Will asks if she's okay with it, but Annie says she's not, and in her anger she throws her phone. Will mentions that Annie lied to them and should have told them when she found out that Charlie was older. He questions why she got into Charlie's car after finding out he was in his 30s. Listening to all the choices that led her to that motel, Annie breaks down and begs her father to leave her alone. Despite this, her father insists on getting answers. Annie yells that things would have been fine if they stopped asking about what happened. She argues that her father is the one acting strange because she knows he checked her phone and looked up criminals online. He explains that he's trying to find Charlie, but Annie insists again that he's not like those criminals. Her father is shocked that his daughter is protecting the man who took her innocence. So he visits Gail the next day, hoping she can help him understand what's going on in Annie's mind. However, the therapist says it's a breach of her client's privacy. Will admits he can't stop thinking about what happened and even had dreams about confronting Charlie. Gail asks how he'd feel if Charlie were arrested. Will confesses he'd be angry because he wants to take matters into his own hands. He's also upset that he didn't know what was happening and his daughter lied to him. Gail concludes that he blames himself for what happened and reminds him that they can't control everything, especially with their children. They can only provide support when needed. Despite Gail's advice, Will can't help but desire justice. He visits a weapons store and then the home of a local criminal he'd found. There, he imagines beating the man and even shooting him. However, he's still at the weapons store and decides not to buy anything. One day he picks up Peter from the station, but his son notices his troubled expression. That night, the family gathers with their relatives for a Halloween dinner. Peter refuses to speak to his sister this time. When he reassures her that he loves her, their grandmother and aunt try to be extra hospitable to Annie. She notices and makes a sarcastic comment. To lighten the mood, their grandfather asks if Peter has a girlfriend yet. Because of this, Annie pointedly asks her father if Peter can have a relationship. When Will refuses to discuss the topic, she loudly asks her brother if he's had any experience with a woman yet, and her father scolds her for it. But Annie argues that their relatives already know about her relationship, so she should be allowed to ask about her brother's relationships. She points out that she didn't want Peter to know what happened, but her father told him. Upset, Annie storms off. On another night, Doug tells the family that they found a DNA match from the samples they collected. However, it matched with unsolved cases of 3 similar crimes, so they still don't have a suspect. This indicates that Charlie may have done the same thing to 3 other women. Annie, still in denial, suggests that they might be his ex-girlfriends. Doug explains that they were much younger than Charlie and reported the crimes committed against them. As Annie learns more about the other victims, her belief that her experience was based on love shatters. Shocked, she excuses herself to the bathroom but sneaks out to meet with Gail. She tells her therapist that Charlie had other women. This makes her realize that she wasn't special to him, although she thinks it means there's something wrong with her. Gail assures her that it's not her fault as Annie breaks down, finally admitting to herself that Charlie only used her. The therapist comforts the traumatized woman as she weeps. Later, the parents take their daughter back home. After Lynn tucks her into bed, she cries about how broken her daughter feels just because someone wanted a few minutes with her. During this, Will continues to go through the documents about Charlie. Lynn scolds her husband for obsessing over the man instead of taking care of their daughter. Will defends that putting the man behind bars is the right thing to do, and since Annie won't talk to him, it's the only action he can take. Lynn, however, believes it's pointless if they can't even provide comfort to their own daughter through this ordeal. As Annie tries to rebuild her life, her family watches her compete at a volleyball tournament one day. During the tournament, Will notices one of the local criminals he had found taking pictures of the team. He confronts him and starts a fight, only to discover that the man is just another player's father who resembles the criminal he saw. After her father's outburst at her school, Annie is embarrassed, and she yells at him when they're home. Will feels guilty and admits he doesn't know what to say. Annie makes it clear that there's nothing they can say to make things better because she feels like her life is ruined. On another day, Annie discovers that some bullies have created a website to make fun of her. This devastates her, so she rushes back to her house. She hides in the bathroom to avoid her father seeing her. She believes her life is over and lies in the tub with medicine bottles nearby. Suddenly, Lynn calls Will, panicked because Brittany told her what happened at school. She asks him to check if Annie has come home. The father hurries and finds the bathroom locked. Worried, he breaks down the door and discovers his daughter barely conscious. After Annie is released from the hospital, they have Brittany stay with her through the night. Lynn blames her husband for lacking empathy in the situation and treats him coldly after things calm down. In the morning, Annie wakes up and sees Will on their lawn. Having not slept that night, she checks on him, and he shares that he was thinking about how she wasn't afraid during her first time in the pool because she trusted him. He was proud that Annie always believed in people, even as she grew older. However, Will feels like he failed because he couldn't protect her on that day with Charlie. He's heartbroken that Annie no longer trusts people even though she still loves them. Will breaks down at the thought of his daughter wanting to end her life, and he begs for forgiveness. Finally, hearing her father's thoughts, Annie embraces him and they cry in each other's arms. This starts to mend their bond as they admit the burdens that have weighed on them since the nightmare began. Meanwhile, in a distant town, a family enjoys their day at a farmer's market. The son takes the camera from his father, who turns out to be Charlie. Just then, a student recognizes Charlie and introduces him to his parents as his physics teacher, Graham Weston. In turn, the man introduces his wife and son, who are completely unaware of his dark secrets. Thank you for watching our video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.